Of the day, number 2.
Appropriation 2014-15 Estimates Bill, third reading.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Appropriation 2014-15 Estimates Bill be now read a third time and the Imprest Supply second for 2014-15 Bill be now read a second time. Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to be able to put this motion to the House as we close off the debate over the 2014 budget, as we close off the budget for 2014, and also as we look into the prospect of a general election just 8 or 9 weeks away. Mr Speaker, this budget underpins a strong economy where the government has sound finances, an economy where there is confidence in the direction of the economy and the conduct of economic policy, and credibility built up on a track record, with 84,000 new jobs last year, and most particularly, Mr Speaker, the confidence in households that they have the prospect of better incomes and finding a job if they don't have one, Mr Speaker. That is the platform for growth, for the prospects for sustained economic performance over the next 3 to 5 years. And, Mr Speaker, it's that sustained economic performance which has the capacity to make a real difference to the prospects for young New Zealanders, that they can take part in a productive economy that gives them scope for the use of their capacities, and also sustained growth that gives the prospect of a lift in household incomes. In the last 2 years, the average wage has lifted by $3,000. In these forecasts that underpin this budget, there is the prospect that the average wage will lift by a further $7,000 by 2018 to over $62,000. Now, Mr Speaker, I must say that there is a sharp contrast in outlook as we approach the election compared to that which we inherited back in 2002. And, Mr Speaker, I have here the 2008 Labor pre-election update, the pre-election update under the previous Labor government. Now, let's just read a brief part of the executive summary. Imbalances have built up, including inflation pressures. Well, inflation was then 5%. Today it's 1.6%. An overvalued housing market. It had doubled in 7 years. It had doubled. And yes, there are housing pressures in the market, and I'll come back to dealing with those, but it's nothing like a doubling in the previous 7 years. Mr Speaker, this is Treasury. They then go on to list high household debt. Well, household debt up to 2008 reached record levels. Our households have never been as indebted as they were in 2008. And then it goes on to say, just to add to the list of its outlook for the economy, so we've already got high inflation pressures, an overvalued housing market, high household debt, in fact record household debt, and a large current account deficit. Now, if there's a moral platform on which the opposition like to strut their stuff, it's complaints about the current account deficit. Well, what was it in 2008? Well, currently it's less than 3%, and the opposition say it's terrible. And I would have thought that if you then went back to look at the current account deficit, if you saw it as a measure of stewardship of the previous Labor government, that if it's bad at less than 3%, it must have been less than that. It was 8%. More than doubled. And in fact, that it had been at record levels in 2006, 2007 and 2008. It had never been that high.
What did they say then?
Well, what they said, well, they didn't say anything, actually. They just didn't talk about it. So, Mr. Speaker, if credibility is an issue, and it always is in an election, then, Mr. Speaker, the current account deficit was worse, sufficiently worse. And that's not the end of the list. That's not the end of the list. Interest rates. The Treasury then refers to implications for interest rates. What they didn't say, which they could have bluntly, is that under Labor's stewardship to 2008, first mortgage rates reached almost 11%. That's a number. I don't think any household today believes that could have been possible. That's how badly managed the economy was then, that in a country where we've had the benefit of 50-year low interest rates, now rising somewhat, that first mortgage rates were over 10%. So, Mr. Speaker, all of those things are dramatically better. Not a little bit better, but dramatically better now than they were then. Now, the point of that is partly underlining the credibility of economic management over the last few years, which has dealt with a major recession, the earthquakes, and now a recovery that brings with it its own risks of growth. But more important than that, it demonstrates that the prospects for sustained growth from here are remarkably better than they were in 2008 and significantly better than they were in 2011. And the platform for that outlook is sound government finances heading into surplus, rising but moderately rising interest rates, moderate inflation, strong export growth, and most particularly the verdict of the people, and that is in the migration figures. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, what this government has focused on isn't just the numbers, it is the resilience and positive aspirations of New Zealanders in their households and in their workplaces. Because what they have demonstrated in the last 5 years is impressive resilience, changing how they do business, becoming more productive, getting on top of their debt, care with their spending, so that now they have built the platform for what could be 3 to 5 years of sustained economic growth that delivers higher incomes and annually tens of thousands of more jobs. And the people who made the decision that that looks likely are the tens of thousands of Kiwis who decided to stay home. Interestingly, tens of thousands of Kiwis, predominantly in the regions that the opposition say are suffering. The net outflow 3 years ago to Australia was 40,000. Last month it was zero. Last month it was zero. Why? Well, partly because the Kiwi battlers have a better understanding of the Australian economy than Australian economists. They know it's more difficult to get jobs in Australia. But more important, they know that if they stay here, they won't be on the dole, they'll be getting jobs. And that's what has happened. This economy has demonstrated an impressive ability to expand the supply of labour and capital to sustain growth. And if we can stick to that, New Zealand will have a period of sustained growth that won't finish off with a collapse like it did in 2008, but will continue into the future, growing at our potential, generating higher incomes year after year. Because I think we've all learned that getting a country in shape is like getting a household in shape. You might get a lucky break, but you probably won't. You have to graft away, doing everything a bit better, as we've set out in our business growth agenda, getting 200 things a bit better. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay a tribute to the New Zealanders in their homes and in their workplaces who've turned this country round. And I also want to pay a tribute to our public servants, because if we can get re-elected, the public service is on the verge of the most substantial, effective shift in delivery of public services to vulnerable New Zealanders and all New Zealanders in 20 years.
I call the honour. Order. The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, the